At the end of 1944, after the failure of the British with the surprise landing at Arnhem, hostilities again took a positional character, and with the onset of winter, the advance of the Allied forces slowed down. The front line almost froze literally and figuratively. While the advancing Allied columns advanced in other countries, the people of Holland had to wait their turn for liberation. When the front became more or less stable, the Dutch patriots in the German rear had to take the initiative themselves if they did not want to sit idle. During that period, up to 60 men daily sneaked through the positions of German units and surrendered to the 1st English or Canadian patrol that came across. Regardless of where they crossed the front line, all defectors were screened. Upon arrival, each defector was thoroughly interrogated after a search. Many defectors were highly resentful of this treatment. Indeed, it was offensive to patriots who had risked their heads to help the Allies. I had to explain to them that intelligence work is like solving a problem with many unknowns. Each defector could have bits of information about German military units and their defensive positions. It did not occur to the defector that such information was valuable and that it should be reported to the right people. Those of us who tried to create a general picture from the fragments often lacked a small fact known to the hapless defector. I was aware that German intelligence was still functioning, but it did not seem to me very appropriate to emphasize this in conversations with defectors. Still, there could have been German spies among the many refugees who were genuine patriots. The Abwehr at the beginning of the war often resorted to this method of sending spies into England, and it was much more difficult to do so then than it is now. There was no doubt that the German command would try to take advantage of such an opportunity to infiltrate the Allied rear. On the day the story I want to tell about began, more than 36 defectors arrived. My assistant and I had to spend a good deal of time to carry out the program we had outlined. Noon came before we had time to go through the personal belongings of the defectors. They were the most ordinary little things that a man usually carries with him: a crumpled photograph of his wife or child, a pen, a pencil, a penknife, a penknife, a penknife, a watch. Some of the refugees did not have a penny on them, but most of them had small sums of money among their modest possessions. 2 piles of things stood out. In one was a wallet with 20 crisp credit cards of 25 guilders each. At the opposite end of the table was another collection of things, and among them also a wallet, which this time contained 15 brand new 25 guilders. This drew attention to itself. Having a good memory for details, I memorized the serial numbers of the bills of the first pack, and was extremely surprised to see that the numbers of the second pack were a continuation. I shared this discovery with my assistant and said that I wanted to question both owners. In order not to arouse suspicion, I decided to interrogate one of them fourth on the list, and the other much later. The first 3 defectors I questioned turned out to be crystal honest people. They came from the same neighborhood, were well acquainted with each other, and their stories confirmed and complemented one another. I shook their hands, wished them success in the fight against the Nazis, and organized their delivery to the headquarters of the Princess Irina Brigade, as the military unit of the Free Holland was called, fighting as part of the troops of the 21st Army Group. It was the turn of the owner of the 20 fresh, crisp papers. He was a sturdy, fierce-looking man a little over 30 years of age. His clothes and general appearance gave him the appearance of a peasant or labourer. His broken fingernails and calloused palms showed that he was more at home with a shovel than counting money. "What's your name?" I asked, though I knew it from the sticker on the sack. "Baku is Flint, sir." It was unusual for an ordinary Dutch farm labourer to have a double surname, but I decided to ignore it for the moment. "Where do you come from?" "Eemnes, sir. It's a small town in the province of Utrecht." "What do you do for a living?" "Agricultural labourer, sir." "How old are you?" 36. I continued to ask him the usual questions about religion, place of study, political party affiliation. I asked for his mother's maiden name, place of birth, brothers and sisters, and so on. Sometimes it was possible to catch a person by asking, for example, the name of his father's sister. If he had a quick reaction, he would invent the name without hesitation. If the interrogator put the same question a couple of days later, the subject, having answered 100 or more questions, forgot the name he had given in the first case. Spies often fall for simple, trite questions. After learning Baku's Flint's background, I asked him, "Do you sympathize with the Germans?" He hastened to express his indignation. "Is that me, sir? Sympathize with the Germans? I hate them all." "You speak like a true patriot," I said. "And tell me, Baku's Flint, what have you done to prove your hatred of your enemies?" "I don't understand you, sir." "Then answer another question. Were you associated with the resistance movement?" "Oh, yes, sir." "Now I understand you. I don't like to boast, but I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to do my part in the fight against the Boche." "Of course," I said. "But before you fled Nazi persecution, did you help the resistance movement?" "Of course I did." "In what way?" Flint didn't answer immediately. "You see, sir," he began, "I had to work in the field, close to the railroad line. It used to happen that after a train had passed, I'd rush to the railroad track and loosen a couple of fasteners. As a result, the next train would derail. What if it was an ordinary passenger train with honest Dutchmen and not a German military transport?" "I've thought of that," Sir Flint grinned. "And as a rule, I made sure in advance that the next train was carrying Germans." "How did you find out?" "I had my ways," he said, hesitating again. "What were those ways?" Flint had to rack his brains again to find a suitable answer. At last he said, "The signalman at the next station is a buddy of mine. He used to give me advance notice." "How far was that station from where you were working?" "About 5 kilometers, sir, maybe 6. "How did he get these messages to you?" "He couldn't have left his post, could he?" "I suppose not, sir, if that's what you think." "How do you want me to think?" "I don't know, sir." Baku's Flint looked very unhappy. The interrogation continued in the same vein. I came to think that the Germans must have been extremely short of men if they turned such fools into their agents. Flint's story was full of absurdities, each of which might have been grounds for suspicion. If he had been the only defector carrying a large sum of money, I would have arrested him at once, but I wanted to use Flint as a possible bait to expose his friend if the latter proved more clever than this small fish. Determined to end the interrogation, I pointed to the pile of money on the table and asked, "Are these yours?" "Yes, sir." "How is it that you happen to have so much money on you?" "This is my life savings." "You must not have saved your savings very long." "What do you mean by that, sir?" "The money looks brand new." "You see, sir," replied Baku's Flint, "I have kept the money in a safe place." There was no point in continuing this chain of questions. Flint's story sounded so unconvincing that for a moment I even wondered if it could be true. The German scout, I reasoned, who had recruited him would no doubt have provided him with a more reliable cover story. Finally I asked, "Do you personally know any of the 30 to 40 defectors who came with you?" "No, sir," he answered without hesitation. "Are you sure about that?" "Yes, sir." After hearing this answer, I turned to the guards and ordered them to take Baku's Flint into the next room and lock him there alone. A plan of further action was already maturing in my mind. In any case, 2 or 3 hours of thinking alone would give my idiotic interlocutor a chance to reflect on his own stupidity. The interrogation of the next few people proceeded without incident. None of the interrogators had any difficulty proving their honesty and explaining their reasons for crossing the front line. Finally, it was the turn of the 9th man, who, like Baku's Flint, had brought with him the savings of his life. When he entered my office under escort, I realized at once that he was a man of a different disposition, both physically and, apparently, mentally. To my questions, he gave prompt and convincing answers. The man's name was Vander AA. He was born in a small place near Eemnes in the province of Utrecht, which was also the home of Baku's Flint. Vander AA was 32 years old. He worked in a machine factory as a foreman. Vander AA was not married, but I had the impression that he was constantly in the company of women, had the appearance of a self-assured man, and this, as a rule, impresses women. What did you risk your life to come here for? I asked him. To join Princess Irina's brigade, sir. But why did you take such a risk? The war will be over in a few months. That's just it, Sir Vander AA answered hastily. Frankly speaking, I did not help the Allies much. I participated in the resistance movement little, and actually did not do anything significant. I thought that this was my last opportunity to do the movement some good. The answer was quite logical. Usually a person who critically evaluates his own actions is sympathetic to the interrogator. What role did you play in the resistance? Oh, sir, he grinned. I wasn't a hero. Some of my acquaintances liked nothing so much as to go out at night, clashing with German patrols or breaking their cars. But I was far from that. I prefer a quiet life. As a boy, I was very fond of playing trains. Do you know what I mean, sir? I think I do. I stayed with a widow. Her house faced the main railroad tracks. I managed to get her to give me the furthest room. In my spare time, I would sit at the window, but at a sufficient distance so that no passerby could see me, and watch the trains. There was a slight rise at this point, and the trains slowed down to such an extent that I could count the number of cars and even see whether military or civilians were on the train. I took notes, accordingly, and passed them on to one of my resistance comrades. How did you contact him? We worked in the same factory. His machine, strangely enough, often broke down, and I, as a foreman, had to fix it. That's how I passed on the information. You were doing a very important job, I said. You, sir, probably know best what to call it, said Vander AA, but I don't want you to think that I am trying to present my actions as extraordinary. So far, this man has answered my questions quite convincingly. Perhaps he only went a little overboard in denying his positive qualities, but after Flint's shameless boasting, it was even pleasant to hear him begin to demand more detailed information about the number of trains passing his observation post per hour in both directions, the average number of cars in the train, the percentage of freight trains, and so on. I was familiar with data on the movement of German troop echelons through Holland, and Vander AA's answers were consistent with reality. By this point in the interrogation, my opinion of Vander AA was bifurcated. He could either be a true Dutch patriot or a well-trained spy who had made the fatal mistake of taking a large sum of money with him. Now, in retrospect, it is fair to say that if Vander AA had not been carrying a wallet full of money, I probably would have taken him for a patriot. I decided to change the line of questioning. Tell me, Vander AA, approximately how long have you been with the resistance movement group? A little over 3 years, sir. During that time, did you meet any prominent members of the resistance, or even hear about them? Of course, sir. Name a few names, please. Vander AA thought for a moment. Well, what is it? You see, sir, it's not so easy to do. Some of them are known only by nicknames. There's a guy who calls himself William Tell. Another one goes by the name of King Kong. I don't know their real names, though. It doesn't matter. Give me the names you remember. Please, sir. Baron den Tex, Verbeek, Flex, Sanders, Shunt, Rolafs, Van Dyke. Vander AA mentioned half a dozen other names. I knew some of them, and especially the first, Den Tex, a true patriot and a well-known leader of the resistance movement. I changed my interrogation tactics again and used my main trump card. How come you had a thick wallet with new banknotes in it? After a subtle pause, Vander AA smiled, and his face turned pink. Ah, to hell with them. You may call me a thief, sir. Frankly, I stole that money before I set out. But you see, sir, I stole it from the biggest crook in our town, and the most active collaborator you'll ever find. He's been collaborating with the Germans since they came. When we were all starving, his shop was bursting with meat, which he sold at a price accessible only to those like himself. So I came to the conclusion that I shouldn't leave empty-handed. He had made money dishonestly, and I thought it would not be wrong to relieve him of some of it. The answer was quite nimble. Human nature is such that we are more likely to believe facts against a man than facts in his favour. If there had not been Baku's Flint behind the wall with a second wad of money, I would probably have accepted Vander AA's explanation without any doubt. "Had anyone helped you to borrow this money from the butcher?" I asked. "No, sir. I did it all by myself." In my opinion, Vander AA had made the first blunder. If he and Baku's Flint, as I suspected, had made a deal between them, my question gave Vander AA an opportunity to mention, as if casually, that he had been helped by one man with whom he had divided the booty. I pretended to listen to him with complete indifference and asked again. "Can you repeat again the names of the members of the resistance movement known to you?" "Of course, sir. Let me just remember. Baron Den Tex, Verbeek, Shunt, Rolafs, Sanders and Van Dyke. I may not have named them in the order I used to." "Right," I said aloud, and thought to myself that this time Vander AA had omitted the name Flex. "Now tell me about the German formations that have been in the area of Eemnes in recent weeks." Vander AA answered quickly, but with enough pauses that made his answer natural. To the east of the town there was a tank repair shop, and next to it an artillery depot. Not far away was a camp which Vander AA believed contained no more than one division or infantry brigade with its attached units. 5 kilometers from the city was the Luftwaffe airfield, but the Germans did not use it. I nodded in agreement. Vander AA information coincided with the information I already had. Then I said, "You defectors, this morning there are about 40 of you. Among them, probably there are people from your neighborhood. Tell me, do you know any of them?" "No, sir," he answered without hesitation. "I may have seen one or two of them sometime, but they are not only friends but even acquaintances. Do you realize, sir, the situation in the resistance movement? The less a man knows, the less the Germans will know if they capture him. I had a couple of close friends from Eemnes who were in the same group as me, but who else was resisting the enemy in our neighborhood? I do not know." Vander AA's answer satisfied me. I complimented him and offered him a cigarette. Then, playing off my embarrassment, I added, "I'm sorry, Vander AA, but my memory is beginning to change. I used to remember perfectly well the facts that I was told once, but now—" I stopped talking and slowly ran my hand across my forehead. "I guess I need to take a break from my work. My memory has become like a sieve. You have already mentioned 2 or 3 times the names of the members of the resistance movement that you know, and I have already forgotten them. Would you mind repeating them again?" "Of course not, sir," he said sympathetically. "I can imagine your situation. You need a good rest, sir." "You're right. But the war won't go on forever." "Well, sir," and he repeated the names again. Needless to say, my memory was nowhere near as shoddy as Vander AA had led me to believe. He repeated the same names, but omitted the name Flex again. "Thank you," I said. "That is all that is required for now. Now I'm going to ask you to sit in the waiting room." "I won't have to wait very long, will I, sir? I want to join Princess Irina's brigade as soon as possible." "I won't keep you a moment longer than necessary. There are a few formalities to fulfill." I smiled and shook his hand. After Vander AA and his escort left, I sat smoking for a good 5 minutes. A plan was forming in my mind. I was almost certain that Vander AA and Baku's Flint were German agents who knew each other, but I had to find evidence of this, trap them and make them confess. Having worked out the details of the plan in my mind, I sent for the assistant, told him of my suspicions and acquainted him with the part he was to play. After the assistant left, I called Vander AA again. He came in and sat down. His demeanor indicated that he was wary. Apparently he found it strange to be summoned so quickly. To make him put aside his wariness, I said, "Would you agree to help me? You are obviously a true patriot, but I have strong suspicions about a fellow who arrived in the same group as you. You must help me expose him." "I'd be glad to help you, sir, but as I said, I don't know anyone who arrived at the same time as me. Still, tell me what I must do." "I'll try to help you." "Well, that's fine. I was sure you'd agree. I hate to accuse a friend, But you've just reminded me again that you have no friends among the new arrivals. Besides, even among friends, duty is still duty. Being a German agent is more unpleasant. You're damn right, Sir Vander AA agreed. What do I have to do? Oh, it's very simple. First of all, look through the observation slit in this wall. You'll see a man sitting in the next room, but he won't see you. Tell me, don't you know him? Vander AA played his part well. It was obviously a surprise to him, too, to see Baku's Flint, but he gave nothing away. You can count on me, sir. I led Vander AA into an adjoining room, guarded from the outside by a sentry. Baku's Flint jumped up. Observing the expression on their faces, I pronounced, "You have both come from the same neighborhood, and perhaps it is time for you to get acquainted. Baku's Flint, let me introduce you to Mr. Vander AA." They shook hands, and I could only marvel at their composure. In my heart, I cherished the hope that the less intelligent Baku's Flint would give himself away in an unexpected confrontation, but he showed only a moderate interest in Vander AA. I invited both to sit down and again asked Baku's Flint a few of the usual questions concerning age, religion, education, and political views. Vander AA seemed outwardly calm, but the glance of his intelligent eyes jumped from my face to Baku's Flint's every now and then. After a few minutes, I stopped my questions. Finding cigarettes in my pocket, I asked rather loudly, addressing both of them, "Would you like a smoke?" This was the conditional signal for my assistant, who had been standing outside the door all this time. He opened the door wide and shouted, "Mr. Flex." Baku's Flint jumped up abruptly with the words, "Yes, sir," the comedy was over. I laughed loudly and turned to Vander AA, who, in spite of all his composure, flinched. "So I remarked, there is a missing Flex, a man whose name you first mentioned, and then for some reason omitted in the list of acquaintances." "Stupid pig." Vander AA hissed angrily. He realized that the game was over. "No," I interrupted, "you are the fool. Never underestimate your opponent. If you mentioned Flex once, you should have repeated the name. By not doing so, you only aroused my suspicion. In any case, you should have compared your equipment before coming here, if only for curiosity's sake. You divided the money you received from your German masters, and it was highly imprudent to keep it in your wallets, especially as the series of bills are the same. Well, gentlemen, who's first to make a full confession?" Vander AA and Baku's Flint, or if you call him by his real surname Flex, were sent to headquarters and were soon brought to trial. I do not know their fate, but I hope they got what they deserved. A man is not worth much if he is willing to sell himself and sell his homeland for 50 English pounds or less, even if they are issued in new, crisp banknotes. It is often said that we live in an age of specialization. It is believed that a man will not achieve much unless in his younger years he sets out on some definite path and concentrates all his abilities in the appropriate field. The late C.B. Fry may serve as a model of a well-rounded man. He made a career at Oxford University, played in cricket competitions as a member of the national team of England, was a world record holder in long jump, a prominent footballer, and once he was even offered to take the throne of the rulers of Albania. This type of man is as extinct as the prehistoric mammoth. The ancient Greeks believed that man develops in all directions as his abilities and capabilities grow, but their ideal, like the language of ancient Greece, belongs to the past. That, at least, is what we were taught in school. Perhaps I represent a relic of a past, less hurried era. I would not wish to be known as vain, but with an innate aptitude for foreign languages, at the age of 30 I was fluent in 6 languages, and had a sufficient grasp of 7 more for work, by good fortune. And again, through such inherited qualities as good eyesight and excellent coordination of the senses, I was able to achieve international class in boxing and shooting. My endeavours allowed me to successfully play bridge with any partner and not fear losing. Looking back, I feel that my life would have been more limited and poorer if I had specialised in one area. Maybe I would have achieved more in that area, but I would have missed out in others. But no matter what people's ideals are, in times of war one is forced to specialise in a certain field. War has become very complex and there is no room for know-it-alls. When a man joins the army, he is trained as an infantryman, artilleryman, sapper, tanker, or a specialist in one of the support services. During his military service, a soldier may be transferred from one branch of the military to another. He may even find himself having to learn a new specialty. But the principle of performing tasks of a single profile remains firmly in place. In the last war, there were many cases when a man sat in the wrong sled, and it was not always without negative consequences. I know, however, a man in his 40s whose father is English and whose mother is French. He himself married a French woman and lived in Paris until 1939. In time, he became assistant manager of a large firm that manufactured automobiles and motors. Not only was he fluent in French and English, but he was also well versed in technical terminology. At the beginning of the war, he quit his job, sold his house, and, inspired by the desire to fulfill his duty to his ancient homeland England, moved with his family to London. On enlisting as a volunteer in the British Army, he listed all his qualities and asked, if appointed an officer, to send him back to France with the British Expeditionary Army and make him a liaison officer between the British and French formations. It seemed impossible to find another such man. He was at once promoted to the rank of officer, and he was posted as a junior officer in a training battalion. France had already fallen when he continued to bombard the War Ministry with requests for transfer as originally proposed. Fortunately for the Allies, the situation in the various intelligence agencies in the last war was generally better than in the example given. In most cases, men who knew a foreign language or country situation were assigned to posts where they could put their knowledge to good use. Many of us have heard of the intelligence sergeant who spent several years after 1941 perfecting his knowledge of Russian. Finally, having successfully passed all his interpreter's examinations and having practiced speaking with the help of a Russian immigrant professor at Oxford, he was declared fit to work in the office of the British military attaché in Moscow. The appointment took place a few days later. And where did you think he would be assigned? To a regiment of Royal Fusiliers in Africa, where the locals, as I recall, speak Swahili. Fortunately for us, there are few cases of this kind. On the contrary, in the intelligence agencies, especially in wartime, there is a tendency towards narrow specialization. If a person was hired, for example, to work in counterintelligence, it was considered almost unbelievable that he would later be transferred to intelligence. In other words, a spy hunter could not become a scout behind enemy lines. And that's understandable. It takes a long time to gain skill and experience in a difficult endeavor. And when a person gets a certain qualification, his superiors are very reluctant to part with him. In addition, an employee, working in a certain area, gradually acquires a specific way of thinking, appropriate to the tasks performed, but little suitable for others. The investigator, who has the ability to critically analyze any testimony and extract from them at least a fraction of the truth, if it was there at all, is unlikely to be able to quickly come up with a legend for himself. The first task requires analytical acumen, the second requires ingenuity and intuition. In addition, no man will be hired for intelligence work unless it is absolutely certain that he can keep a secret. Braggarts and talkers are not only dangerous, but they are usually and easily recognized. A secret agent must be able to keep a secret from his friends, and sometimes even from his own wife, if he is to keep himself alive. The intelligence officer quickly becomes accustomed to keeping quiet. This system and tradition is wonderful for the lower levels of the apparatus, but I have often thought that during the First World War, and especially during the Second World War, there should have been a joint intelligence fund in the Intelligence Directorate to which the various agencies could send the information they extracted. This kind of organization certainly existed on paper, but my personal experience has shown that it was hardly ever used in practice. Take France, for example, on whose territory, due to its strategic importance and the increased concentration of German troops, the activities of intelligence had a particularly important purpose. The British had a wide network of agents, operating under the direction of the relevant section of the Directorate of Special Operations. The units of fighting France, under the command of General de Gaulle, had their own network of agents, operating independently of the Directorate of Special Operations. When large contingents of American troops began to arrive in England, the United States set up its own intelligence service, operating under the auspices of the Office of Strategic Services. And as a result, it often happened that a request for certain information was not only duplicated, but also went through 3 channels, and the results were shared little. An agent could obtain important information that was already resting in the files of a rival intelligence organization less than a kilometer from Whitehall. I write deliberately about rivalry, for my experience has shown that very often the intelligence of one of the Allies fought not only against the Nazis but also against the intelligence of its partners. National pride in wartime is a good thing only up to a certain point. It should not lead to wasting time and risking human lives because of donkey stubbornness and unwillingness to share intelligence already available. Here is an example. In 1944, a young Dutchman, one Pelcor, reached England on a simple dinghy. He was involved in the affairs of the organisation that provided the transfer of refugees by sea from Holland to England, but the motives for which he agreed to work in this organisation, it was difficult to establish, and there was a strong possibility that he was an agent of the enemy. After hours of interrogation, I could not come to any definite conclusions about his honesty, and, acting on the principle of not trusting a person if there is even the slightest doubt, instructed to refrain from using Pelcor in any work where he could come in contact with classified information, as well as not to let him out of the country until the end of the war. The following year, already in charge of a counterintelligence mission in Holland, I met Pelcor again in a prisoner of war camp set up by the Gestapo. I immediately interrogated him and learned that shortly after I had instructed to keep him under surveillance and not to release him from the territory of England, he established contact with representatives of the American Office of Strategic Services. They trained Pelcor and dropped him as an agent in his native Holland. Fortunately for the Allies, Pelcor turned out to be a true patriot. However, such a case could easily have ended with another case, known in the British counterintelligence, under the ill-fitting name of the English game. In the English game, the traitor managed to infiltrate a group of about 50 Dutch agents as a result. All of them were captured on arrival in Holland. Many were executed by the Gestapo. Important secret information also fell into enemy hands. The great risk associated with the Pelcor case could easily have been avoided if the various Allied intelligence agencies had worked, as they say, in a single harness, rather than competing with each other. To become a British agent, a candidate must first pass the most stringent reliability and psychological tests. The intelligence authorities quite rightly seek first of all to find out what motives prompted the volunteer to embark on this path. If it turns out that he was led by mere romantic feelings, the services of such a volunteer politely but firmly refused. A person who is attracted only by fame may not show sufficient determination when the going gets tough. Such people tend to boast of their adventures at the first opportunity. A candidate selected for a secret mission must undergo a special and difficult training program away from London for several months. The training program includes parachute jumps, practice in handling various types of personal weapons and explosives, acquiring skills in radio communications, photography, as well as training in unarmed combat techniques, that is, the silent destruction of the enemy. In addition, all possible changes in the terrain chosen for the agent's future actions were studied intensively. The safety of the agent himself and the lives of the members of the resistance group associated with him could depend on such simple circumstances as knowing the curfew in the area or the availability of a certain type of cigarettes. Despite strict selection and solid training, the percentage of agents captured by the Gestapo immediately after arriving at their destination was considered very high and even alarming. Some were turned in by traitors from the fifth column, some were rounded up as a result of the arrest of a member of a resistance group, who under torture gave the names of his associates. In addition, intelligence chiefs suspected that some agents failed because of their own mistakes. For example, the case of a female agent who was about to cross the road in a French town is known. She instinctively looked first to the right, as they do in England with the left-hand traffic there. For a moment she forgot that on the continent one must look left first when crossing a street. An observant person noticed her mistake, and this put an end to her not yet begun activity as an agent. It occurred to the intelligence leadership that our counterintelligence colleagues might be able to help in a common cause. Men who had devoted years to the study of suspected enemy agents were obviously in a position to check the readiness of their agents and could perhaps suggest some remedies for the deficiencies they had identified. Thus, one morning 3 young men entered my office accompanied by their guardian. The latter was obviously proud of his charges and seemed to have every reason to be. "When are they leaving?" I asked. "The day after tomorrow," was the reply. "Will they be dressed as they are now?" "Yes." "Who will they be portraying?" "Belgian businessmen or petit bourgeois, not very rich, not very poor, but earning a decent living." I nodded in approval. The young men's suits were appropriate, unpretentious, not very new, but not too shabby. Obediently, I walked over to the guy closest to me, put my hand behind his vest, and pulled out his tie. A store label was sewn on the back of it: Selfridge, Oxford Street, London, West 1. "Take them away," I said to the faint-hearted guardian. "They will not be able to explain to the Gestapo how the Belgian businessman manages to buy during the war ties on Oxford Street in London." Later, another young man was brought to me for testing. His legend was that he had fled Brussels when the Germans entered and spent 8 months in the south of France, working as an agricultural labourer on a flower plantation in Grasse. Then he became fed up with the hard physical work and returned to Brussels. This man was born and brought up in Belgium, and Brussels was his hometown. From this part of his biography, the Gestapo couldn't find anything to implicate him. Then I asked him to show me his hands. The ends of the fingers were soft, there was no roughness on the skin of the palm, the nails were not broken. These hands could not be mistaken for those of a man who had been engaged in heavy agricultural labour for the past 8 months. When I asked him about the varieties of flowers grown on the plantation, he had only the most general knowledge of them. As in all such cases, I had to send him for a second training course. I considered and continue to consider it a tragedy that brave and advanced young men should expose themselves to unnecessary risk for lack of the simplest training. My preliminary remarks apparently do not give the reader any coherent impression. Let them then serve as a background for my account of how I, a counterintelligence officer, had to play the role of judge, jury and prosecutor in the case of 2 suspected agents, a father and son. One morning in the summer of 1942, the phone rang in my office. A familiar voice wasted no time in being polite. "Could you be at work tonight?" "What's the matter?" Another failure on the other side. "Have you heard about Gabriel?" I answered in the affirmative. "A torpedo boat picked him up off the coast early this morning. He'll arrive in London this afternoon and be brought to you at once. He'll tell you everything himself. There's something wrong, and you've got to help us find out. Will that be all right?" Of course I answered, knowing the man who spoke and his tendency to exclude verbal husks from conversation. There was no point in asking further questions at this point. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help thinking about what might have happened. The failure could have been serious. The leadership would certainly not send a fast torpedo boat across the North Sea just to invite some Dutchman for a cup of tea. Taking a man off the Dutch coast, which was well illuminated by searchlights and closely guarded by patrol planes and fast patrol boats, was a rather risky venture. Obviously the matter was urgent. I knew Gabriel only by hearsay. Gabriel was the pseudonym of a former sailor who had been ferrying people from the Dutch coast for 2 years. It was one of the most difficult tasks a man could face in wartime. Every metre of the coastline was monitored around the clock, patrols were stationed at every cape, regular raids were conducted from the sea, and all harbours and ports were occupied by German troops. It was impossible to get fuel for motorboats, and every craft larger than a dinghy was not only on the lookout but also registered. Yet Gabriel's organisation helped nearly 100 refugees get out of Holland within 2 years. As a young boy, Gabriel was apprenticed to a master builder of boats and small seagoing vessels. The Germans didn't know about it. By some miracle, he repaired old boats in a hidden place from prying eyes, and even built new ones from pieces and wrecks that were snuck out of the harbour area. Gabriel's group consisted of men whose entire lives had been spent at sea. They would have been able to guide any gunboat through the Kiel Canal if instructed to do so. This group was a powerful weapon in the hands of the Allies, and now was going through a difficult moment. Gabriel, I learned, was known for his religious fanaticism. It was said that in his youth, Gabriel had wanted to become a priest, but his lack of education and the need to help his father in the household had prevented him from doing so. But over the years, Gabriel lost neither zeal nor piety. He did not drink or smoke, and always carried a Bible with him. He read it so often that he knew many passages by heart. I was told that his speech was full of quotations from the Holy Scriptures. He even borrowed his pseudonym from this scripture. Gabriel's proud patriotism was like a sword thrust against the Nazis. Knowing all this from rumours, I was looking forward to meeting Gabriel. About 6 o'clock in the evening, I saw from the window of my office a dusty staff car. 2 men got out of it. In one of them I recognised an officer attached to the headquarters of the Free Holland Armed Forces. The other, a man of short stature and middle-aged, was apparently the formidable Gabriel. In a few minutes they were sitting in my office. For a while we chatted on distracted topics. It was mostly the liaison officer and myself who spoke. Gabriel sat on the edge of his chair, leaning over. He was clearly impatient to get down to business. I watched him surreptitiously. Gabriel was wearing an old, greasy, baggy suit. A thick blue sailor sweater peeked out from under his jacket. He had a mop of dishevelled grey hair on his head. A thick net of deep wrinkles covered his weathered face. The most remarkable thing about him were the eyes under his bushy eyebrows, bright and clear as a child's. "Well, all right," I said. "You didn't come all this way just to talk about the weather. What happened?" "You tell me." "These events concern you first and foremost," the officer suggested to Gabriel. Gabriel's story was similar to many others I had heard before. The details were different, of course, but the theme was the same. Gabriel's group consisted of 12 people, including himself, because of the special significance of the number 12. And the religious zeal of the leader, a joker in the group, had dubbed the members apostles, a title that remained with them, much to the leader's displeasure. Gabriel personally selected the members of the group from among people he had known for a long time and trusted completely. Over the course of 2 years, the group lost several members. One of its members drowned during a violent storm, another contracted tuberculosis after spending hours in cold water, and a third was blown up by a sea mine. Each new candidate was selected with great care. Gabriel rejected one of the best sailors in the district only because he was a hardened drunkard. After all, when drunk, a man can spill all his secrets. Thanks to Gabriel's caution, the group was successful until recently. The group sometimes got into unforeseen skirmishes with the Germans, but since for combat operations the same stretch of coast was never used twice, and any operation was postponed, if there were warning signals, the members of the group were not seriously worried. Then suddenly everything changed. One night, 3 weeks ago, when the boat carrying the next batch of fugitives was ready to leave and was in a small cove known only to the group, and maybe half a dozen experienced sailors, it was suddenly illuminated by a searchlight. Shots rang out over the heads of the fugitives. The boat was surrounded by soldiers of German patrols who had crept up unnoticed in the darkness. All the refugees, and one of the 2 accompanying members of the group, were detained by the Gestapo. According to the plan, the 2 members of the group, who were with the refugees, were to be picked up at sea by the 3rd participant of the operation and together with them on a small dinghy to return to the Dutch shore. After the refugee boat passed the minefields. The escape was made by a young man of athletic build named Loen, whose father was also a fellow member of Gabriel's group of apostles. Being a good swimmer, he swam about 1 kilometre out to sea, turned and swam the same distance parallel to the shoreline, and then headed for the shore. The German patrol had already left the area during this time. This incident was already a great misfortune in itself. But the worst was ahead. The following week, a new boat full of refugees set sail from an abandoned wharf in another part of the coast. She passed safely through a narrow passage between minefields and made it to the open sea, without adventure. But at the moment when she quietly passed the anchored German air defence ship, searchlights suddenly lit up the sea again, and a swarm of speedboats, approaching the boat, riddled it with machine gun fire. No one returned from this trip. 2 members of the group and 17 refugees died. At first we thought we had been punished by the hand of God, Gabriel said. Fate had favored us for many months. But we couldn't count on it forever. Another thing happened last week. For more than 6 months I had been repairing an old fishing boat. A man gave us an automobile motor. 2 of my assistants, former ship's mechanics, and installed the motor on the boat. Then we raided a German fuel depot and took enough fuel to cross the North Sea. First of all, however, it was necessary to test the boat. For this purpose, I went to sea with my deputy named Van Loen and 2 people who knew the engines. It was a moonless night. We took the boat out to sea on oars, as we thought that the noise of the engine might attract the attention of the Germans. When we were already in the open sea, I ordered to start the engine. One of the mechanics turned on the ignition. There was a big explosion. The stern of the boat was blown to pieces, and the 2 men standing by the engine were killed. Fate spared Van Loen and me. We were standing on the bow, and the force of the explosion threw us into the sea. The boat sank and we had to swim to shore. Do you suspect sabotage? I asked, but it sounded more like a statement than a question. What else? Gabriel looked me in the eye. The 2 guys who had assembled the motor were both masters of their craft. And even if a gasoline engine has problems, it doesn't explode with such force. Someone had connected a fuse to the ignition, which resulted in an explosion after the motor was turned on. I had to agree. There was no other answer. Couldn't the Germans have rigged the whole thing? I asked. Why would they do that? Gabriel objected. If they had attacked the boat by accident, they would have either destroyed it or ambushed it. The Gestapo prefers a dead man to a live prisoner. Those bloody dogs know they can make a living prisoner talk and betray his friends. I was beginning to find Gabriel's arguments convincing. All right, I said. Let's rule out the Gestapo. It would mean that in your group is a traitor. Do you agree with that? Gabriel shook his head negatively. I would prefer to give it another explanation. But is it possible? He said with despair in his voice. The first 2 failures might have been bad luck, but the last one. So my old friend, the man who fought and suffered with us, risked his life, is a Judas. It pains me, but I must recognize this fact. What's more, now I almost certainly know who the traitor is. Almost. I asked you again. Yes, it was like this. After reaching the shore, Wang Lun and I went to my hut, which was nearby. Wang Lun needed to dry his clothes, as it was at least unwise to appear outside in clothes with water dripping off them after curfew. Besides, the noise of the explosion might have alerted the German patrols. We sat down by the fire and began to discuss what had happened. Our group numbered 12 men, and there were 7 left. The traitor had to be one of the survivors, since even a traitor does not kill himself by organizing the death of others. I was confident and believed that he could not be Wang Lun. Wang Lun must have come to the same conclusion. Then we decided to set aside our feelings of friendship and affection for the other 5 members of the group and try to determine which one was the traitor. It was hard, but necessary. We talked through the night, but we still couldn't come up with an idea of who the Judas was. Finally, we decided to set a trap. The next night after dark, I called all the survivors to my house. I explained that the boat had sunk because of an accident, and pretended that the incident had not aroused any suspicion in me or Van Loen. I said that it was urgent to replace the boat, as we had to send a new group of refugees in a few days, and suggested that we steal the boat from a German marine warehouse, saying that Van Loen and I would do it the next night. All the others at once volunteered to go along with us, but I declined on the pretext that only 2 men were required for the impending business. To this I added that it was probably our blunder that had caused the loss of the boat, and it was for Van Loen and myself to provide a substitute for it. The traitor, I reasoned, would not dare to contact the Germans during the day, and as the operation was to take place the following night, he must meet his masters immediately after the members of our group had met at my house. Both Loen, father and son, lived in the northern part of the town, while the other 3 lived south of the harbour. The group meeting ended around 10 o'clock in the evening. Its 5 participants slipped out of the house one by one. Wang Lun and I announced that after the meeting we would go to the warehouse for reconnaissance and went out with the others. We of course had no thought of approaching the German warehouse. Van Loen began to follow the 3 members of the group heading south of the bay, and I followed the Leuven trail. At first I was lost in the darkness, but that didn't bother me. I knew that the Gestapo commandant lived in a house on the mountainside a kilometre from the street where the Loens lived. There were sentries at the front door and the back door, and I didn't dare get very close. Assuming that the traitor would use the back door, I hid in a ruined house about 200 metres from the back door. The porch was dimly lighted, but I had my binoculars with me, and I expected to make out the face, or at least the silhouette, of a man coming out of the house. As I took up my observation position on the top floor of the ruined house, the sentry at the back door to the commandant's house called out to someone, and he slipped through the door before I could point my binoculars. But I knew that sooner or later he would come out. So I watched. Half an hour passed. It was cold, and my joints ached. At last the door opened again, and I caught a glimpse of the silhouette of a tall man with his head uncovered, dressed in a jacket and coat. The man disappeared again into the darkness. I saw him for a second, maybe less. "And you recognized him?" I asked. "More or less." "What do you mean, more or less?" "That's what it means," Gabriel replied. "The Gestapo commandant usually chose large soldiers as sentries. They have a more imposing appearance. And yet the man who quickly passed the sentry was taller than him. I'm short, as you can see. Wang Lung is a little taller than me. The other 3 are of average height. The eldest Loen is nearly 6 feet tall, and his son is even taller. The father's hair is grey, the son's blonde. In the light of the lantern over the porch of the commandant's house, they would look like white. Both father and son wear navy coats. So you suspect the father or the son? But you're not sure which one?" I asked. Gabriel nodded affirmatively. "But couldn't it all be a coincidence?" I suggested. I realize that such a coincidence is hard to imagine, but sometimes strange things happen. Another unknown Gestapo informer, for example, could have been a tall, blonde man who also wore a jacket and a coat. There must be several people in your neighborhood who look like that. That night I prayed to fate that it would be so, said Gabriel. But when Van Loen and I arrived at the warehouse the next night, we found the posts doubled and an ambush set up at the docks. If we hadn't waited for complications and weren't ultra-cautious, we might have fallen into a trap. I already knew from Van Loen that the 3 members of our group, whom he had been watching, had gone straight to their homes after the meeting. There could be no doubt the Gestapo had been tipped off by one of the Loens. "Did you do anything about it?" I asked. "I saw only one solution to kill them both," said Gabriel. "Doesn't the Bible say, 'Vengeance will be mine'? I will repay, saith the Lord. True, one of them may be innocent, but one man's life is not worth more than the lives of 5 members of our group, and all the people we could have saved from the Gestapo." Van Loen turned out to be smarter than me. He thought of something. And that's why I came to you. What did he think of? We need to act quickly before the case is damaged further. As soon as I get back to Holland, we'll steal the boat from the Germans. That shouldn't be too hard to do. Then I will entrust both Leuven, father and son, to manage the boat in transporting a party of refugees to England. They will wait for the embarkation of 10 or 12 men, but no one will show up on the day of departure. The boat will be prepared, and I will direct the Loemans to England alone, by force of arms if necessary. I assume that the traitor, having been given the task of escorting the boat, will not tell the Germans of the crossing being prepared, or will arrange with them not to touch the boat. If the enemy does sink the boat, so much the better, we will be rid of the traitor. Is that clear? It's a clever plan. I can't say I said with a grin. I like the plan, but won't your present trip to England make the traitor suspicious? He doesn't know about it, Gabriel replied. I have an elderly aunt in Rotterdam, and she has been ill for a long time. Officially, I left last night for Rotterdam, and should be back in 2 or 3 days. The radio operator who relayed to one of your torpedo boats a request to pick me up is known only to Van Loen and myself." "I think you did the right thing," I remarked. "It may not be easy to decide which of the two suspects is the traitor, but we'll do our best to find out as soon as they get here. At any rate, the traitor will be out of the picture for the rest of the war." "That's right," Gabriel muttered. "The war won't last forever, and the day of reckoning will come. If the traitor ever returns to Holland, I will kill him with my own hands." We talked for a while longer. Then I wished Gabriel a good journey and a safe return. The liaison officer of the Free Holland military headquarters, who had been silent during the entire conversation with Gabriel, suggested that we set up a code signal to report Gabriel's arrival in Holland by radio and call this Operation Exodus 14. That same night, Gabriel was taken by car to the east coast and set off for Holland. 2 days later, I was informed by telephone that the code signal Exodus 14 had been received. This meant that Gabriel had returned safely and the trap for the traitor was set. On the morning of the 13th day after that, I received a report that a boat with 2 Dutchmen on board had docked at a deserted river mouth a few kilometres south of Harwich. The 2 Dutchmen were badly emaciated and were rushed to the hospital to prepare them for a trip to London in 2 or 3 days. They were under guard but had not yet been interrogated. The message also indicated that they were both very tall and remarkably similar to each other. I had no doubt that they were the Loens, and gave orders that no attempt should be made to interrogate them, but that they should be kept apart for the time being, and that a convincing pretext should be found for doing so as not to arouse suspicion. I also ordered that whichever of the detainees was first able to move should be sent to London. The youngest of the detainees, Jan Loen, was the first to regain consciousness. 3 days after his arrival in England, he was taken to London and found himself in my office. I am of average height, but this bony giant towered over me. His head was adorned with a mane of scraggly, faded, almost white hair. He was one of those wiry, skinny giants who usually have great physical strength. At first we talked about the ordeal of crossing the North Sea, but of course I tried not to show my knowledge of him and the resistance group Gabriel was leading. Jan told me that he and his father had, in peacetime, run a small trawler that the Germans had confiscated after taking Holland. After that, he and his father had made a few odd jobs on the coast. His father was a widower, and the two of them lived together in a small house north of the harbour. Shortly after the occupation, an old acquaintance of their family named Van Loen suggested that they join a resistance group led by another acquaintance of theirs, known by the nickname Gabriel. They discussed the proposal, decided they had nothing to lose, and joined the group. They had been successfully helping refugees for a long time, but in recent weeks their luck had changed. Jan then told of his ordeal, how he had been saved from being killed when the Germans suddenly attacked a boat carrying refugees that was ready to leave. He also told how the boat that Gabriel, Van Loen, and the other 2 members of the group had tested had been sunk. "I know a little English," he told me, "and I once had a conversation with an English pilot who had been shot down over Holland and was hiding from the Nazis. The pilots believed in the existence of evil gnomes and attributed unexpected engine or navigational compass damage to them. So I think the evil gnomes left the pilots alone for a while and came after us. Everything was going smoothly up until then. We've lost 5 men lately, and we still can't figure out what's causing the failures. The night my father and I set sail for England, none of the refugees who were about to leave showed up by the time we set sail. We waited for almost an hour, and then the senior of the group, Gabriel, declared that we should go alone. Now there were only 5 people left. If things continue like this, we'll have to disband the group in a couple of months." "How was your crossing of the North Sea?" I asked. "Evil dwarves accompanied us," Ian said unhappily. "The outboard motor on the boat failed halfway across. Then suddenly there was a big storm, rain clouds obscured the stars, and we lost our bearings. To top it all off, the rudder broke. I had to reattach it. I tied my father to the mast and myself to the rudder. The high waves were threatening to wash us overboard every minute. Fortunately, the wind was blowing north-northeast, steering us toward the English shore, or we would have either drowned or ended up on the Dutch coast. I probably questioned Jan Loen for another half an hour. Instead of starting with one fact and putting the questions in chronological order, I went backwards, then forwards, giving the impression of haphazard questions and lack of purpose. Asked Jan about his childhood, and, after barely hearing the answer, went back to his activities in Gabriel's group. This method sometimes justifies itself in talking to clueless people who are confused in their own thoughts and can talk, but it rarely gives the desired result in relation to people with a sharp mind and only exacerbates their sense of vigilance. In any case, as far as Jan Loen was concerned, the method described did not justify itself. Jan took his time in answering my questions and did not contradict himself when I asked a question again from time to time. There was nothing objectionable in his slowness, and perhaps I would have suspected him more if he had answered all my questions very quickly. Finally, I came to the most important question. In recent weeks, your group has lost 5 men out of 12, I said. In addition, the enemy managed to detain more than a dozen refugees. At the same time, in the previous 2 years, the losses of your group were relatively small. What do you have to say about that? What do you mean, sir? Ian asked idly. I imagine the situation in this way: either the losses were accidental, or someone is responsible for it. What do you think? I stepped forward. Do you think that one of us, muttered Jan, hesitating to say the fateful word, gave the group to the enemy? What I think doesn't matter. What do you think? I repeated. Ian hesitated to answer. I can't believe it, he said at last, barely audibly. Who among us could have done such a thing? We had known each other for years and were friends. No, it's impossible. Neither of us could have been a traitor. He paused again, and then evidently realized the meaning of my question. I hope, sir, you are not suggesting that I could have been the traitor? You are gravely mistaken. Besides, I barely escaped the Germans by swimming when they first attacked us. A traitor wouldn't risk his life. I'm not accusing you of anything, I said calmly. I'm only suggesting one possibility. I'm telling you, sir, it's impossible. I absolutely refuse to believe it. You might as well accuse my father. By the way, what about my father? When will I finally be allowed to see him? I'm amazed it took Jan so long to take an interest in his father. Your father is doing well, but the transition has taken its toll. He's in good health, but he's twice your age, and the elderly don't recover as quickly as the young. You will see him as soon as he is able to receive visitors. When will that be? That depends on the doctors. Perhaps 2 or 3 days. That was the end of my first meeting with Jan Loen. When the sentries took him away, I had 3 cigarettes in a row. Then I wrote a letter to the command of the unit that had captured the boat in which the Loens had made the crossing, asking for a complete list of the property found in the boat and the personal belongings of the detainees. These data were communicated to me by telephone the next morning. There was nothing in the boat except a soggy piece of bread. It was left to assume that everything else had been washed away by the waves during the storm. The list of Loen's personal belongings also yielded nothing new. His father carried a tobacco pouch, an old-fashioned lighter with a storm cap, a pocket compass, a sea knife, a few small coins, a handkerchief, and a crumpled piece of paper. The ink on the sheet was smudged, but it was obviously a crude diagram of German barriers off the Dutch coast. Among the son's belongings were found a nautical knife, a handkerchief, and a few coins. In the inside pocket of his jacket was a leather wallet containing 3 photographs of girls and 2 letters written in different female handwriting. They were passionate love letters, leaving no doubt that the writers were in the most intimate relations with young Loen. I gradually formed at first a vague, but then a more definite view of the man, but I did not want to jump to a conclusion. I still had to question his father. The opportunity soon presented itself. When Loen Sr. came into my office, I was struck by the extraordinary resemblance between father and son. Indeed, at night they could easily be confused, even by a man who knew them both well. The father, apparently, was 2 or 3 centimeters shorter than his son, but just as broad in the shoulders, a little stooped and thin. No sooner had I begun my questioning than he asked impatiently, Where is my son? I haven't seen him since we arrived. They keep telling me that he is well, but when I ask to see him, I am met with various excuses. Tell me, is it true that he's alive? I need to know that. Of course your son is alive and well. I spoke to him in this very room just 3 days ago. Why can't I see him? We didn't want to delay talking to him because he might have important information. I'm afraid I'll have to keep you away from him for a while longer and ask you the same questions. However, I can promise you that you will see him very soon. The elder Loen sank into his chair with relief. My questions were still on the same topic as the conversation with my son, and both Loen's answers matched. I heard again how Van Loen had suggested they join Gabriel's unit, and how well things had been going until recently. However, when I asked what was the reason for the recent setbacks, the elder Loen gave an answer quite different from his son's. I think we have been betrayed, he said firmly. What makes you think that? Only logic. We all know Gabriel well and trust him. He's not a hot young man who would take a risk for nothing. Gabriel was always cautious, carefully selecting people, and always changing the location of his meetings. 1 or 2 failures could be explained by coincidence, but 3 or even 4 failures in 1 month was too much. No, there can be no question of some kind of evil fate. This is the work of a spy. Suppose you're right. Which one of you is the spy? Loen looked at me blankly and shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. The suspicion began in me after the second accident, but I did not share my thoughts with anyone. It's hard, you see, to ask tried and true comrades if any of them are working for the enemy. But the details could have led you to the traitor's trail, I insisted. An accidentally dropped word, a guilty look. Let's try to solve the problem by the method of elimination. Could Gabriel be a spy? It is impossible, answered Loen. And Van Loen? Absolutely not. I could vouch for him with my life. Good. Then perhaps you were the spy? Or your son? How dare you? Loen thundered back. How dare you accuse my Ian? Accuse me if you like. I can stand up for myself, but don't touch my son. He would never betray his father or his comrades. Loen was wearing an open collar shirt, and I noticed the lace around his neck. It's too early to accuse anyone, I said soothingly. I just need to know the truth. By the way, what do you wear around your neck? Loen slipped his huge hand under his shirt, pulled out a cloth pouch by its string, took it off his neck and threw it on the table. Look for yourself, he said. I untied the pouch and shook its contents out onto the table. A wedding ring, a strand of blonde hair tied with string, and an ID card were all that was in there. What's this for? I asked, pointing to the ID card. I'll need it. Ty. But the authorities here will give you a new identity card. I don't intend to stay here, he said sharply. I must go back to Holland. I have a job waiting for me there. Do you want to go back? To risk your life again? I didn't say I wanted to go back, Loen replied simply. It's my duty to be there. I changed the subject. Mr. Loen, do you know how an internal combustion engine works? Of course I do. I had a skiff with an outboard engine before the war. Is your son familiar with the engine? Naturally. I had no more questions for the old man. I let him go and wished him a good night's rest. When he got up, he asked again when he could see his son. I had only to assure the old man that he would not have to wait long. Old Loen took a cloth bag from his desk, hung it around his neck, nearly crushed my hand in a bearish handshake, and then, dragging his feet awkwardly, left the office. What to do next? I thought, lighting another cigarette. Who is the traitor, the father or the son? Both of them have equal opportunity to inform the German authorities about the plans of the detachment. Both are honoured members of the group and enjoy the confidence of all. In favour of the son was the fact that in the first case, which allowed suspicion of treason, he was a member of the crew of the boat and escaped death only because of his training. A traitor would hardly have risked his life. However, given that the Germans captured the refugees and one of the members of the group without a fight, the rescue of Loen Jr. could have been coordinated with them in advance. Another fact testified in favour of the father. He brought his Dutch identity card with him and declared his intention to return. The son, on the other hand, probably had no intention of returning and preferred to leave the unit. But the question arose, why did old Loen want to return? To continue to fight the Germans or to continue to spy in their favour? Or maybe the traitor is the old man's son, who got cold feet and decided to get away from the vengeful Gabriel. A comparison of the father's and son's answers revealed that up to a certain point they were in complete agreement, but at the same time they differed sharply in two respects. When I asked the son what he thought had caused the recent series of failures, he did not give a definite answer and was surprised by the version I put forward of betrayal. The father, however, in response to this question, immediately said that the reason for the failures was the activities of a traitor. Was the son so honest that he could not even imagine betrayal by one of his friends, or was his reaction consistent with the behaviour of a venerable spy who decided that he should behave in such a way during interrogation? Was his father an honest man who expressed his innermost thoughts without fear or hope of reward? Or was he an even more experienced enemy agent who believed that demonstrating honesty was the best line of defence? The Loewen's different reactions to my suggestion that one of them was a traitor were also characteristic. The younger Loen indignantly protested against such an assumption only against him. The father, on the other hand, was more indignant at the accusations against his son. The behaviour of two people so close to each other was also different. The young Loen only asked about his father at the very end of the conversation, while the father's first question at the inquest was about his son's state of health. The father's love for his son was clearly stronger than the reciprocal feeling. Was this strong paternal feeling a breeding ground for betrayal? Could it be that the father had entered into a deal with the Gestapo in order to keep his son safe? I began to recall the various occasions for betrayal that I had encountered in my years of practice. One such reason was hatred connected with the desire for revenge. A man might be so influenced by passion for a woman in the enemy's camp that he would sacrifice his honour for her. Blackmail can also induce betrayal. Sometimes a person's actions are determined by considerations of personal gain. Vanity, greed, lascivious life, acute sense of inferiority, these are the qualities that in the right environment can push a person to betrayal. I do not have a degree in psychology, but I have seen depressed people, and I have repeatedly had to analyze their character to determine the reasons for their actions. As a rule, their character was influenced by selfish feelings. A person who places himself and his interests above everything else, and above all above the interests of society, is more prone to betrayal than other people. Having reached this stage of speculative research, I decided to resume my questioning of the younger Loen. After he had settled himself in his chair, we chatted for about 5 minutes about nothing. Then I said, "You must be a good swimmer, Mr. Loen." "Yes, sir. I guess I am a really good swimmer," he replied, smiling shyly. "You are modest. Tell me, when the Germans suddenly attacked the boat with refugees, before it had time to leave, how far did you have to swim to escape?" "A good 5 kilometers, sir." "That's splendid. But I'm not quite sure how it happened. Could you tell me more about this incident?" "Certainly, sir. There were 2 of us from Gabriel's group. We were tasked with bringing a boatload of refugees to England. We pulled the boat close to the shore. I was on the bow, holding it up, and Philip stood at the edge of the shore and helped the passengers board. Suddenly a searchlight flashed at a distance of no more than 50 meters and blinded us, followed by a second one from the other side. Shouts in German were heard, and I realized that we had been discovered. The passengers, who had already managed to get into the boat, suddenly stood up. This caused the boat to rock violently, and I could hardly hold on to it. Panic gripped the people. Some were trying to get into the boat, others, on the contrary, were hurrying to get ashore. It became clear to me that there was no way to get away, and that everyone had to escape as best they could. If I had remained in the boat, I should have been captured. Fortunately, the shore rises steeply at this point, and under the bow of the boat the depth was 3 or 4 meters. I dived off the side of the boat, swam about 20 meters underwater, and then surfaced for a breath of air. Then I dived again and swam underwater for a long time. There were shouts and noise from the shore, but fortunately the Germans did not turn their searchlights toward the sea, and I swam calmly. That was all. That was a good one, I said approvingly. You have nothing to blame yourself for having escaped in this way. They used to say, "He who fights retreats only to prepare for new battles." You could not have been more useful to Gabriel if you had relied on fate and allowed yourself to be captured by the Nazis. By the way, how did you get your sea boots off in the water? I wasn't wearing sea boots, replied Loen, without hesitation. I was wearing moccasins. That's interesting. I smiled. The sailor is going to take the boat with the fugitives across the North Sea to England. It's no Sunday stroll. Hundreds of kilometers of stormy seas ahead. During such a crossing, the waves inevitably slam over the side and the water covers the bottom of the boat. And despite this, you, an experienced sailor, put on your moccasins. Would you like me to tell you why you did that? Because you knew from the start that the boat was not going to make the journey. It was agreed with the Nazis that you would go swimming, so you put on your moccasins to make it easier to move in the water. You didn't understand me. Loen began to justify himself. I did not understand. I interrupted him. I don't think so. It was a pretty clever plan. If you developed it, then congratulations to you. Gabriel's unit was betrayed, and you thought no one would suspect a man who had almost fallen into enemy hands of treachery. No, I doubt you devised this plan without help. All this is very reminiscent of the idea of my old acquaintance, the head of German intelligence in Holland Giskix. Junior Loen blinked and shook his head sharply. I don't know what you're talking about, he shouted. I have never heard of the man whose name you have mentioned. I am not a traitor. It is you who are the traitor, I objected. Moreover, I will get your confession, even if I have to sit here with you for the rest of the war. But Jan Loen proved to be a tougher nut to crack than I had anticipated. I worked with him for about a week, returning again and again to the question of the moccasins. I mocked him, shouted at him, urged him to confess. Once I even claimed that Gabriel had recognized him as a traitor and had seen him leaving the German commandant's house at night. I set more and more new traps, but Loen, once slipped, did not repeat the mistake. One time I put him in a room equipped with microphones for eavesdropping and arranged a meeting with his father. Before doing so, I made sure that the father knew that there were strong suspicions about his son, but even to his own father, Jan Loen, did not admit anything. He stuck to his story, claiming that he wore moccasins that night because they were more comfortable to walk in. His sea boots were under the struts on the bow of the boat. He allegedly intended to put them on immediately after going to sea. I discussed Loen's case with the leading officer of the military prosecutor's department, and we had to recognize that the evidence against Loen was clearly insufficient to convict him in the usual way. The Germans had seized the boat, and there was not a single witness who could confirm or deny Loen's claim that the boots were on board the boat. The father could not be expected to oppose his son. As long as young Loen persevered, his life was safe. Young Loen spent the next 3 years in an English internment camp. I think he realized that every day he lived brought him closer to a harsh and merciless sentence that we could not pass and enforce based on the laws that existed. Loen Sr. died 6 months after his arrival in England. The official report of the cause of his death said that he never recovered from the severe ordeal of his last sea crossing. But I personally believe that he died because his heart could not withstand the trials of another kind. Even for lack of sufficient legal evidence, the elder Loen inwardly realized that his son had been exposed as a traitor. With the end of the war in Europe, the hunt for spies did not stop. They no longer posed a serious threat to the security of the Allied countries, but one had to look to the future. Among other things, justice demanded that the guilty be punished. Collaborators and war criminals had to be identified. A few weeks after the end of the war, I found myself in Scheveningen near The Hague. One day I received an anonymous letter written in pencil in block letters. The text read, MS, Sander is a Hun mistress and a spy. It is your duty to investigate her case. death to traitors. Counterintelligence received a lot of such letters. As I said, war always brings a lot of dirt to the surface, and it usually takes a long time before it settles down. This is especially felt in a country that has been under enemy occupation for nearly 5 years. Under such conditions, there are always people who find it easier to make a deal with the enemy than to resist him. The mayor, the doctor, the priest have to make desperately difficult decisions. Should they still fulfill their duties and try to alleviate the plight of their fellow citizens, even if it means cooperating to some extent with the occupiers? Or should they go underground and sacrifice their duties to others for the sake of their personal reputation as patriots? When the war is over, there are people who feel it their duty to expose both real and imaginary collaborators of the enemy. The motives for such people's actions may be varied patriotic impulse or the desire to get even with an old enemy. I scrutinized the anonymous note. The paper on which it was written was nothing special. It was a standard size and shape, without watermarks. The handwriting gave reason to suspect that the author was a reasonably educated man, but at the same time it spoke of the author's haste, for in several instances the printed letters were joined. At the end of the sentences there were dots circled. I confess I was sorely tempted to crumple up and throw this sheet away. I was swamped with work, I was already short-staffed, and I felt no respect for people who did not have the courage to sign their name to a serious accusation against others. Nevertheless, I decided to suppress the temptation. As the author of the letter pointed out, it was my responsibility to investigate such cases. If someone disliked Ms. Sander so much that they dared to accuse her anonymously, there must have been enough gossip about her, perhaps even threats of physical violence. If she was innocent, I could at least save her reputation by investigating her. Sander is a common surname in Holland, and it took me 2 days to compile lists of all the married women in the area who bore it. As a result of the subsequent work on the list, I was able to reduce it by elimination, leaving only one candidate among the suspects. Apparently this was the Mrs. Sander referred to in the letter. Her husband was the owner of a small printing shop in Scheveningen. After occupying the town, the Germans decided to use the print shop to their advantage and forced Sander to supervise the repair of equipment at the company. By all accounts, Sander proved to be a true patriot and helped the local organization of the resistance movement. The print shop printed orders and instructions for the troops occupying the area. The Germans made sure that Sander could not learn the contents of the printed orders. Thanks to his powers of observation, however, he was able to pass on very useful information to the resistance movement. At the end of July 1944, the Gestapo arrested Sander. This may have been the result of the carelessness that possessed him, but it is possible that the Gestapo, having discovered the leak, set a trap and Sander fell into it. He was held for several days in the local Gestapo office, and then he disappeared. None of the members of the resistance movement organization I interviewed at the time knew what had happened to him, but everyone feared that he had been secretly murdered. However, in early April 1945, a month before the end of the war, Sander reappeared. Gaunt, looking more like a garden scarecrow than a human being. Sander said that the Germans had tortured him and showed the round scars on his left arm, where, he said, one of the Gestapo interrogators had pressed a burning cigarette to try to get him to talk. The Gestapo then transferred him to a special camp in northwest Germany. After the Allies entered Germany, the prisoners were driven east on foot. Sander took advantage of the panic during another air raid and escaped. He wandered for several days until he was caught up by forward Canadian units. After a proper check, Sander was allowed to return to his hometown. Naturally, Sander was greeted as a hero. A member of the resistance movement who did not flinch under torture and managed to escape deserved such a welcome. A few weeks before Sander's return, however, strange rumours spread in the city concerning his wife's behaviour. She had lived in Amsterdam for a long time. She had moved to the area several years before the war began and had no close relatives here. According to rumours, soon after Sander's arrest, his wife became the mistress of a Gestapo officer who lived in one of the rooms of Sander's apartment, on the second floor of the same building where the print shop was located. People told with a bitter chuckle that while Sander was cheating the Nazis in his print shop on the first floor, his wife was cheating him with the Nazis on the second floor. The delicacy of Sander's situation after his return to the city was that he knew nothing about the rumours that had been circulating around town regarding his wife's behaviour. For obvious reasons, no one could have the courage to tell the returning hero unverified information, especially during the celebrations dedicated to him. Doubts of this kind tormented me. Is it worth reopening the wounds that have healed? Is it necessary to investigate in order to open a pustule under a healthy skin, which will make impossible the newly established happy, as it seemed to everyone, married life? I pondered. And yet, in the end, I found it necessary to take up the matter. In order to prevent the spread of further gossip, I decided not to summon Mrs. Sander to my apartment, but to visit her at her apartment, pretending as if it were an ordinary courtesy visit. I chose the time for the visit so that Sander would not be at home. Mrs. Sander herself opened the door and, when I introduced myself, invited me in. While we chatted about nothing, I tried to get an idea of the hostess. In my opinion, she was in her mid-30s. She was not, from my first impression, a full-figured and lovely woman, nor did she have the ability to arouse instant passion. At the same time, however, she had a warmth that was hard to detect. It was easy to imagine that a German officer far away from home and family liked this woman. She was clearly not stupid. After a few minutes of conversation on general topics, she smiled and said with a winning directness, "Mr. Pinto, I am sure you are very busy with work and have not come to see me just to talk about the weather and post-war worldly problems. Obviously, you have a more important reason." All I had to do was smile back and agree. "Yes, Mrs. Sander, you are right, and so allow me to proceed without further delay." Without another word, I took out an anonymous note from my wallet and held it out to her. "Please read it." Mrs. Sander looked at it, shuddered, turned pale for a moment, and then her whole face flushed. She dropped the sheet on the floor and sat for several minutes with her hands over her face and her head bowed low. At last she said softly, "You, Mr. Pinto, must be a great master of interrogating people." "I suppose so," I answered. "And, after all, do you get the truth out of them?" I shrugged. "I hope that's more often the case, Mrs. Sander continued, "and that there's no point in my trying to fool you. Sooner or later you will get to the facts. This letter is fair and yet unfair. Let me explain." And she told me her story. At first she was confused, but gradually she regained her composure. During the 5 years of the occupation, several German officers of senior rank had been quartered in her house in turn. They kept themselves courteous, spent time in their rooms, and spoke to her or her husband only when necessary. In the middle of 1944, another lodging officer left and his place was taken by Major Hauptmann, an SS officer who had been severely wounded in Russia and had been assigned to Holland. He was younger and, as Mrs. Sander recognized, more attractive than his predecessors. He smiled and wished her good morning when they met on the stairs. On several occasions he invited her and her husband over to his place. Strange as it may seem, it was she who was at first against establishing such a relationship with a German, considering it wrong. But her husband insisted that she should be kinder to Major Hauptmann. Mrs. Sander knew of her husband's connection to the resistance movement and suspected that he wanted to give the Major the impression that they were friendly to the Nazis in order to somehow keep himself safe. Disaster struck less than 2 months after the Major had settled in their apartment. Her husband was arrested, and he barely had time to warn her about it. That same evening Hauptmann came to see her. He said that her husband was safe for the moment, but that this was unlikely to continue for long, as he was considered an enemy of the Reich and deserved severe punishment. Hauptmann also said that it would be up to him to decide her husband's fate, and the severity of the punishment would largely depend on whether she accepted his offer. In order to preserve her husband's life, the Major said she must show favourable treatment to the judge, that is, to him. It was a classic situation honour in exchange for her husband's life. Mrs. Sander said that at first she was tempted to throw herself at the Major and claw at his smiling face. But she restrained herself. She could only try to evade a direct answer and buy time. Seeing her hesitation, The Major agreed to wait until 9 o'clock in the morning. All night she did not sleep, thinking about how to get out of the situation. In her soul she still had a hope that the Major was joking, and her husband would soon be released, but gradually she realized that these hopes were in vain, and that her husband was really threatened with immediate death if she did not give in to the Gestapo's demand. There was no time to consult anyone, and it seemed dangerous to violate the Major's order not to tell anyone about their conversation. However, other thoughts came into her head. What guarantee did she have that Major Hopman would keep his word if she became his mistress? And would he be able to keep his promise even if he wanted to do so? Mrs. Sander felt that the risk was inevitable. If she refused, her husband would surely die. Consent offered some small hope of saving him. The next morning she announced to the Major that she had agreed to become his mistress, but on the condition that she would receive proof that her husband's life had been spared. 2 days later, Major Hopman brought her a copy of a secret Gestapo order stating that her husband had been convicted of crimes against the Reich, sentenced to indefinite confinement in a concentration camp, and was to be sent to the northwestern regions of Germany. That same evening, Mrs. Sander became Major Hopman's mistress, and so it went on for nearly 6 months. From time to time the Gestapo man told her that her husband was healthy and well. Once he even showed her a note with her husband's scribbles, and she recognized his handwriting. After the failure of the desperate attempt of Hitler's command to counterattack in the Ardennes, German units one by one began to evacuate to Germany. Major Hopman left. Mrs. Sander was left alone in the house that belonged to her husband. She knew that the people of the town suspected her of having an affair with the Major. When she appeared in the local shops, women met her with hostile glances, and friends defiantly turned away when they met her. And yet no one had made any accusation against Mrs. Sander. She herself could not begin to tell everywhere about her transgression. Besides, with Hopman's departure, she had lost the opportunity of receiving information about her husband, and his fate had become a matter of great concern to her. The last time, just before Christmas, Hopman had told her that her husband was well, and what had happened since then Mrs. Sander did not know. Mrs. Sander's worries were understandable, as at the time there were terrible rumours about the fate of concentration camp inmates. According to one of them, Himmler ordered the extermination of all prisoners. It was also said that on a secret signal passed from camp to camp, the prisoners revolted and forced their way to freedom. Mrs. Sander had no means of ascertaining whether her husband was alive. She still loved him dearly, and, wishing him well, sometimes in her heart hoped that he had died a quick death and without agony. And then he came back. He was gaunt, ragged, bruised and scarred, but alive. He was so weak that for several days she had to nurse him like a sick child. Strangely enough, he seemed to show no interest in how she lived in his absence. Her husband spoke only of the concentration camp and the terror of the unknown that gripped the prisoners, who would be included in the next batch to be sent to the gas chambers. When his strength returned to him, they lived a normal married life again. Mrs. Sander realized that she would never be able to admit to her husband what a dear price she had paid to keep him alive. As for her husband, he seemed to have lost his former autonomy and ability to make decisions, lost interest in the print shop, and once said with some strange irritation that the noise of the printing presses gave him a headache. Every day he became more and more irritable, and yet he carefully avoided solitude. Mrs. Sander was suddenly silent. Her story sounded true, but there was much to verify. "I understand how difficult it must have been for you to tell all this," I said sympathetically. "Can you answer a few questions?" She nodded in agreement. "First of all, let me ask, is there any physiological reason why you and your husband don't have children?" "No," she answered quickly. "At least I think there is. When we were married, we wanted to enjoy ourselves for a few years, and then the threat of war came, and we decided it was not the time to have children. Those reasons persisted later on. Tell me, did you never hear anything more about Major Hopman?" "Nothing," replied Mrs. Sander. "When he left, he said that what had happened was just an episode. He promised not to try to reconnect with me and not to spoil my life." "How did the Major feel about you?" Mrs. Sander thought for a moment and then said, "I think he really loved me." "And what feelings did you have for him?" I asked after a short pause. She did not answer at once. It was evident that she had difficulty finding the right words. "I don't expect you to understand me, but I think I was close to loving him." I realize that sounds strange. After all, this man forced me into cohabitation and made me break my vow of marital fidelity. I should have hated him, but he was affectionate and attentive, and I was lonely. Gradually I came to believe that, however low this woman fell morally, she could not be called a traitor. If her whole story had been a jumble of lies, if she had deliberately seduced a German officer and condoned her husband's expulsion, and finally she had betrayed the interests of the Dutch people, she would certainly have told me that she had hated the vile Major Hauptmann and had tolerated his embrace only to save her husband's life. Her apparent candour led me to believe her innocence. Nevertheless, I continued my questioning. "Tell me, Mrs. Sander, did you and your husband have a conversation about your relationship with the German officer? In such a small town, where rumours spread very quickly, probably found a hunter to tell him about the sinfulness of his wife." "No," she answered. "He may suspect something, but he has never asked me directly. Since his return, he has never once spoken of what happened in his absence." "You said your husband had lost interest in work. What do you live on? After all, your pre-war savings must have been exhausted long ago." "The people of the city have been very kind to us," she replied. "The mayor set up a special fund in my husband's honour, and many of those who lived well donated large sums." She hesitated, and after a moment added, "I was not comfortable taking that money." "Why?" "Not for any reason you can think of. The day I returned, my husband was almost faint. I had to undress him myself and put him to bed. There were thick wads of money hanging from his waistband under his underwear. I didn't count them, but there must have been several thousand guilders. And you don't know where he got the money from?" "I know. He was honest with me. I asked him about the money when he was feeling better. He told me that after he escaped from the camp, he once had to hide in a ditch until a convoy of German trucks passed by. Suddenly an English airplane appeared overhead. It began to dive and fire machine gun fire at the convoy. One of the trucks caught fire. 2 soldiers who were in it rushed away. In the turmoil that followed the raid, my husband crept to the truck and pulled 2 or 3 crates out of the back, hoping to find food in them. When he opened the crates, he saw that they were full of money. It was obviously the truck of a divisional cashier that was carrying the money. The husband reasoned that this was one of the few fortunes a man can have during a war, and took as much money as he could carry. "I don't think anyone would blame him for that," I said. "If I had escaped from the concentration camp, I would have tried to get a per diem and a lifting allowance." At that time footsteps were heard on the stairs. "It must be the husband, Mrs." Sander said, confused. "We must think of something. He mustn't suspect." "Let me take over," I interrupted her. "Don't worry." A man of medium height, thin, with a mop of light blonde hair and blue eyes entered the room. He was obviously surprised to see a man in an officer's uniform in his wife's room. I immediately went up and introduced myself. "Lieutenant Colonel Pinto from the Dutch Counterintelligence Mission. I came to clarify some questions, and your wife kindly offered me a cup of coffee." "What do you want to know?" he asked sharply. "I am carrying out an assignment from the Chief of Intelligence of one of our formations," I politely replied. "They have managed to capture several senior SS officers who will later be tried as war criminals. 2 of them were active in this area and lived in your house. I am tasked to find out how these men behaved, whether they are guilty of any crimes and the like." "What are the names of these officers?" Sander asked. "One goes by the name von Buchwald. The other is Hauptmann," I answered calmly. Sander's eyelids trembled slightly. The muscles of his face tensed. "The name Buchwald does not tell me anything. In 4 years, more than a dozen German officers stayed in our house. Some stayed only a few weeks or even days. I don't remember a man with that surname. Hauptmann is another matter. We both remember Hauptmann." Don't we, my dear? He finished, turning to his wife. For a split second, I thought that last remark had a double meaning. Your wife has just told me that Major Hauptmann lived here and left when the German troops retreated. Would you like to make a formal accusation against him? Does that mean that I will have to appear as a witness at the trial? Sander asked. I shrugged my shoulders. As much as I hate Nazis, I confess I can't accuse Major Hauptmann of anything. He had behaved quite properly. He was the initiator of my arrest, but he can always claim that he was only doing his duty. In the eyes of the Nazis, I was guilty of crimes against the Reich, and it wasn't Hauptmann's fault that I earned this one. Sander turned down the sleeve of his shirt. On the back of his left hand, I saw 2 round scars, each the size of a small coin. This happened when Hauptmann handed me over to the Gestapo. It is of course difficult for me to say how Hauptmann behaved after my arrest, Sander said, looking at his wife, but before that I had no reason to accuse him of crimes against humanity. The thought flashed through my mind again that this seemingly innocuous remark had a hidden meaning. Mrs. Sander immediately came to her husband's aid. You don't have to worry about that, she said. Major Hauptmann has always been very courteous. Besides, he had had too much to worry about in recent months because of the failures of the war, and there was no time to offend a lonely woman. I decided it was time to end the conversation. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Sander. Unfortunately, I have to go. By the way, I added, turning to my husband, I'd appreciate it if you'd drop by to make an official statement that I could send to the appropriate authorities. This kind of formality is simply necessary. Could you come this afternoon? I thought the war was over, Sander replied, but I see I was wrong. We still have to obey military orders, although their form has changed. It's not an order, I replied, forcing myself to smile. It's a suggestion. Both officers lived in your house. You obviously don't mind giving them a fair trial, do you? I can't refuse, if that's all it comes to. In any case, I have nothing to do. Because of the lack of ink, the printing press can't work now. Back in my office, I thought for a long time about how to find the right solution to the problem. Finally, I thought of using a technique that has helped me many times in times of need. Calling the duty officer, I ordered to find among the captured archival documents a notebook or diary of an officer, preferably with military insignia on the cover. Everything was ready, and I waited for Sander to show up. Sander arrived around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It seemed to me that he was in a better mood now than he had been in the morning. But at the same time I felt that he had prepared for the meeting and was alert. Well, Mr. Sander, I probably have more experience in drafting documents. If you'd like, I'll dictate to you what you have to write. Please feel free to correct me as you see fit. Is that okay with you? I don't mind, Sander replied. Good. What's your name? Ernst. That's where we'll start. I, Ernst Sander, residing at this place, hereby declare that the statement given on June 14th, 1945, is a voluntary confession and is made of my own free will. I paused and looked in his direction. This introduction is necessary so that the defence in court cannot claim that the confession was obtained from you under duress. So where were we? Oh yes, at my personal request, let's continue. After the arrival of the occupiers in Holland, and until my arrest by the Gestapo at the end of last year, the exact dates can be given later, various officers of the German army lived in my house. I understand that the investigation is primarily interested in 2 of them, Colonel von Buchwald and Major Hauptmann. I do not remember the officer who bore the former surname, but I wish to state that none of the officers who lived in my house ever showed disrespect to me, or my wife. At the time of my arrest, Major Hauptmann was living in our house. He conducted himself as befitted an officer and a decent man. I also declare that his friendship and assistance convinced me of the necessity of cooperating with the German authorities and assisting in the realization of their plans. I gave Hauptmann a great deal of information about the Dutch resistance movement and was well paid for my treachery. My arrest was set up on purpose. Sander jumped up. What are you saying? He shouted. You want to trap me. But I won't sign that statement. You may not sign it, But you can't deny that everything here is right. You're no hero of the resistance movement. You are a dirty traitor to your people. Sander's blue eyes threw sparks of anger. Who betrayed me? I know. My wife did. Sit down, I said calmly. Your wife didn't do it. She stayed loyal to a scoundrel like you. You've been exposed by this diary, and you yourself have already confessed everything. I pointed to the cover of the diary, but I didn't dare to open it. Sander could recognize from the handwriting that it was not Hauptmann's. You didn't think I went on. That Major Hauptmann is such a punctilious but careless man. He is methodical enough in noting the rewards given to you, and at the same time careless he left the diary as he flew away. Besides, we would hardly need this written evidence. You gave yourself away. What do you mean by that? Sander almost growled. You agreed in advance with Major Hauptmann about the arrest. The fact is that the situation around you was heating up, and sooner or later the resistance fighters would have found out where the information was leaked. And these so-called scars on your left arm. You've obviously never seen the scar that a burning cigarette or cigar leaves on the body. The skin is stretched, and a crease forms in the place of the scar, and you have smooth skin on your arm. Some Gestapo man helped you fake those scars with a coin soaked in a weak acid solution. Didn't he? What about the money you were carrying on your belt? You were in Germany and you want to make people believe you escaped from the camp. What was that truckload of regimental or divisional cash in the form of crates filled with guilders? There were no German units in Holland by then, and if this imaginary truck was on its way to some German unit, wouldn't the soldiers and officers be surprised if they were suddenly given Dutch money in Germany? This money was received by you from your German masters for services rendered to them. Sander grinned. Bo. That may be true, but you have no proof. Who would believe an unsubstantiated accusation against a recognized resistance hero like me? Not a living soul. And Hauptmann's diary? I asked, tapping the cover of my notebook. I swear it's fake. Hauptmann tried to force me to cooperate, and when I refused as befits a good Dutchman, he retaliated by making false entries in the book. What if we introduce Hauptmann himself? Hauptmann is either dead or in hiding. Besides, who's more likely to be believed, an SS man or a national hero? You're resourceful. But what I'm saying is true, isn't it? Of course it is, Sander said with a sly grin. Now I have proof, I said. Did you notice the bouquet of tulips on the table? One flower has bent more than the others. That's because it has a microphone attached to it. Sander didn't end up on the gallows, even though he deserved it. I couldn't get him to sign a confession. The coroner wouldn't accept the microphone recording as evidence. The hero's fame helped Sander. Efforts to locate Major Hauptmann were unsuccessful. Sander had to be released as found not guilty of treason. Not only was I very sorry that the despicable traitor had escaped a fair trial, but I felt remorse for another reason as well. In my fever, I had not asked Sander what had made him write an anonymous note accusing his own wife. I was convinced that it was he who had written it. Typists often write in block letters, and so quickly that they often connect the letters to each other. They also develop the habit of circling dots so that the typesetter can easily distinguish them from commas. I also remember well the confusion of Sander's wife when I showed her the anonymous letter. She, of course, recognized her husband's handwriting immediately.